This is a remote cabin radio and 11 Lab special narration of UFO History Compilation 2. The Mantell UFO Case of 1948. The Mantell UFO incident was among the most publicized early UFO reports. The incident resulted in the crash and death of 25-year-old Kentucky Air National Guard pilot Captain Thomas F. Mantell on the 7th of January 1948 while in pursuit of a UFO. Historian David Michael Jacobs argues the Mantell case marked a sharp shift in both public and governmental perceptions of UFOs. Previously, mass media often treated UFO reports with a whimsical or glib attitude reserved for silly season news. Following Mantell's death, however, Jacobs notes, the fact that a person had died in an encounter with an alleged flying saucer dramatically increased public concern about the phenomenon. Now, a dramatic new prospect entered thought about UFOs. They might be not only extraterrestrial, but potentially hostile as well. Overview. Mantell was an experienced pilot. His flight history consisted of 2,167 hours in the air, and he had been honored for his part in the Battle of Normandy during World War II. On the 7th of January 1948, Godman Field at Fort Knox, Kentucky received a report from the Highway Patrol of an unusual aerial object near Maysville, Kentucky. Reports of a westbound circular object, approximately 250 feet to 300 feet in diameter, were received from Owensboro and Irvington, Kentucky. At about 1:45 p.m., Sergeant Quinton Blackwell saw an object from his position in the control tower at Fort Knox. Two other witnesses in the tower also reported a white object in the distance. Base Commander Colonel Guy Hicks reported an object he described as very white and about 1/4 the size of the full moon. Through binoculars it appeared to have a red border at the bottom. It remained stationary seemingly for 1.5 hours. Observers at Clinton County Army Airfield in Ohio described the object as having the appearance of a flaming red cone trailing a gaseous green mist, and observed the object for around 35 minutes. Another observer at Lockbourne Army Airfield in Ohio noted, just before leaving it came to very near the ground, staying down for about 10 seconds, then climbed at a very fast rate back to its original altitude, 10,000 feet, leveling off and disappearing into the overcast heading 120 degrees. Its speed was greater than 500 miles per hour in level flight. 4 P-51 Mustangs of Sea Flight, 165th Fighter Squadron. Kentucky Air National Guard already in the air, one piloted by Mantell, were told to approach the object. Blackwell was in radio communication with the pilots throughout the event. One pilot's Mustang was low on fuel and he quickly abandoned his efforts. Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, the first head of Project Blue Book, notes that there was some disagreement amongst the air traffic controllers as to Mantell's words as he communicated with the tower. Some sources reported that Mantell had described an object which looks metallic and of tremendous size, but according to Ruppelt in the report on unidentified flying objects, others disputed whether or not Mantell actually said this. The other two pilots accompanied Mantell in steep pursuit of the object. They later reported they saw an object, but described it as so small and indistinct they could not identify it. Mantell ignored suggestions that the pilots should level their altitude and try to more clearly see the object. Only one of Mantell's companions, Lieutenant Albert Clemens, had an oxygen mask, and his oxygen was in low supply. Clemens and a Lieutenant Hammond called off their pursuit at 22,000 feet. Mantell continued to climb, however. According to the Air Force, once Mantell passed 25,000 feet, he supposedly blacked out from the lack of oxygen, hypoxia, and his plane began spiraling back towards the ground. A witness later reported Mantell's Mustang in a circling descent. His plane crashed at a farm south of Franklin, Kentucky, on the Tennessee-Kentucky state line. Firemen later pulled Mantell's body from the Mustang's wreckage. His wristwatch had stopped at 3:18 p.m., the time of his crash. Meanwhile, by 3:50 p.m., the UFO was no longer visible to observers at Godman Field. The Mantell incident was reported by newspapers around the nation and received significant news media attention. A number of sensational rumors were also circulated about Mantell's crash. Among the rumors were claims that Mantell's fighter had been shot down by the UFO he was chasing, and that the Air Force covered up evidence proving this. Another rumor stated that Mantell's body was found riddled with strange holes. However, no evidence has ever surfaced to substantiate any of these claims. In 1956, Ruppelt wrote that the Mantell crash was one of 3 classic UFO cases in 1948 that would help to define the UFO phenomenon in the public mind, and would help to convince Air Force intelligence specialists that UFOs were a real physical phenomenon, Ruppelt 30. The other 2 sightings were the Gorman dogfight and the Chiles-Whitted UFO encounter. The 1952 UFO flap over Washington, D.C. The 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO incident, also known as the Washington Flap or the Washington National Airport sightings, was a series of unidentified flying object reports from July 12 to July 29, 1952, over Washington, D.C. The most publicized sightings took place on consecutive weekends, July 19th, 20th, and July 26th, 27th. The events of July 19th and 20th at Washington National Airport on the Potomac River. At 11:40 p.m. on Saturday, July 19, 1952, Edward Nugent, an air traffic controller at Washington National Airport, today Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, spotted 7 objects on his radar. The objects were located 15 miles south-southwest of the city. No known aircraft were in the area, and the objects were not following any established flight paths. Nugent's superior, Harry Barnes, a senior air traffic controller at the airport, watched the objects on Nugent's radar scope. He later wrote, "We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft." Barnes had 2 controllers check Nugent's radar. They found that it was working normally. Barnes then called National Airport's other radar center. The controller there, Howard Coughlin, told Barnes that he also had the objects on his radar scope. Furthermore, Coughlin said that by looking out of the control tower window he could see one of the objects. A bright orange light. I can't tell what's behind it. At this point, other objects appeared in all sectors of the radar scope. When they moved over the White House and the United States Capitol, Barnes called Andrews Air Force Base, located 10 miles from National Airport. Although Andrews reported that they had no unusual objects on their radar, an airman soon called the base's control tower to report the sighting of a strange object. Airman William Brady, who was in the tower, then saw an object which appeared to be like an orange ball of fire trailing a tail. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. As Brady tried to alert the other personnel in the tower, the strange object took off at an unbelievable speed. Meanwhile, another person in the National Airport control tower reported seeing an orange disk about 3,000 feet altitude. On one of the airport's runways, S.C. Pierman, a Capital Airlines pilot, was waiting in the cockpit of his DC-4 for permission to take off. After spotting what he believed to be a meteor, he was told that the control tower's radar had picked up unknown objects closing in on his position. Pierman observed 6 objects, white, tailless, fast-moving lights, over a 14-minute period. Pierman was in radio contact with Barnes during his sighting, and Barnes later related that each sighting coincided with a pip we could see near his plane. When he reported that the light streaked off at a high speed, it disappeared on our scope. Meanwhile, at Andrews Air Force Base, the control tower personnel were tracking on radar what some thought to be unknown objects but others suspected, and in one instance were able to prove, were simply stars and meteors. However, Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport observed an orange-red light to the south. The light would appear to stand still, then make an abrupt change in direction and altitude. This happened several times. At one point, both radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews Air Force Base were tracking an object hovering over a radio beacon. The object vanished in all 3 radar centers at the same time. At 3 a.m., shortly before 2 jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware arrived over Washington, all of the objects vanished from the radar at National Airport. However, when the jets ran low on fuel and left, the objects returned, which convinced Barnes that the UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and behaving accordingly. The objects were last detected by radar at 5:30 a.m. Around sunrise, E.W. Chambers, a civilian radio engineer in Washington's suburbs, observed 5 huge disks circling in a loose formation. They tilted upward and left on a steep ascent. Publicity and Air Force reaction. The sightings of July 19th and 20th, 1952, made front-page headlines in newspapers around the nation. A typical example was the headline from the Cedar Rapids Gazette in Iowa. It read, "Saucers swarm over Capitol" in large black type. By coincidence, USAF Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, the supervisor of the Air Force's Project Blue Book investigation into the UFO mystery, was in Washington at the time. However, he did not learn about the sightings until Monday, July 21st, when he read the headlines in a Washington area newspaper. After talking with intelligence officers at the Pentagon about the sightings, Ruppelt spent several hours trying to obtain a staff car to investigate the sightings, but was refused as only generals and senior colonels could use staff cars. He was told that he could rent a taxicab with his own money. By this point, Ruppelt was so frustrated that he left Washington and flew back to Blue Book's headquarters at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Before leaving Washington, Ruppelt did speak with an Air Force radar specialist, Captain Roy James, who felt that unusual weather conditions could have caused the unknown radar targets. Events of July 26th and 27th. At 8:15 p.m. on Saturday, July 26, 1952, a pilot and stewardess on a National Airlines flight into Washington observed some strange objects above their plane. Within minutes, both radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews AFB were tracking more unknown objects. A master sergeant at Andrews visually observed the objects. He later said that these lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There was no trails. They traveled faster than any shooting star I've ever seen. Meanwhile, Albert M. Chopp, the press spokesman for Project Blue Book, arrived at National Airport and refused several reporters' requests to photograph the radar screens. He then joined the radar center personnel. By this time, 9:30 p.m., the radar center was picking up unknown objects in every sector. At times, the objects traveled slowly. At other times, they reversed direction and moved across the radar scope at speeds calculated at 7,000 km/h. At 11:30 p.m., 2 jet fighters from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware arrived over Washington. Captain John McHugo, the flight leader, was vectored towards the radar blips, but saw nothing, despite repeated attempts. However, his wingman, Lieutenant William Patterson, did see 4 white glows and chased them. Suddenly, the glows turned and surrounded his fighter. Patterson asked the control tower at National Airport what he should do. According to Chopp, the tower's answer was stunned silence. The 4 objects then sped away from Patterson's jet and disappeared. After midnight on July 27th, Major Dewey Fournette, Project Blue Book's liaison at the Pentagon, and Lieutenant John Holcomb, a U.S. Navy radar specialist, arrived at the radar center at National Airport. During the night, Lieutenant Holcomb received a call from the Washington National Weather Station. They told him that a slight temperature inversion was present over the city, but Holcomb felt that the inversion was not nearly strong enough to explain the good and solid returns on the radar scopes. Fournette relayed that all those present in the radar room were convinced that the targets were most likely caused by solid metallic objects. There had been weather targets on the scope too, he said, but this was a common occurrence and the controllers were paying no attention to them. 2 more jets from Newcastle AFB were scrambled during the night. One pilot saw nothing unusual. The other pilot moved towards a white light which vanished when he closed in. A Capital Airlines flight leaving Washington spotted odd lights which remained visible for about 12 minutes. As on July 20th, the sightings and unknown radar returns ended at sunrise. White House concern and the shoot-down order. The sightings of July 26th and 27th also made front-page headlines, and even led President Harry Truman to personally call Captain Ruppelt and ask for an explanation of the sightings. Ruppelt, remembering the conversation he had with Captain James, told the President that the sightings might have been caused by temperature inversion, in which a layer of warm, moist air covers a layer of cool, dry air closer to the ground. This condition can cause radar signals to bend and give false returns. However, Ruppelt had not yet interviewed any of the witnesses or conducted a formal investigation. CIA historian Gerald Haynes, in his 1997 history of the CIA's involvement with UFOs, also mentions Truman's concern. A massive buildup of sightings over the United States in 1952, especially in July, alarmed the Truman administration. On July 19th and 20th, radar scopes at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base tracked mysterious blips. On the 27th of July, the blips reappeared. White House concern may possibly have resulted in an order to shoot down the UFOs, reported in various international news service stories on July 29, 1952. One such story reported that jet pilots have been placed on a 24-hour nationwide alert against the flying saucers, with orders to shoot them down if they ignore orders to land. An Air Force public information officer, Lieutenant Colonel Mantell confirmed the directive, stating, "The jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down." It was further stated that no pilot had been able to get close enough to take a shot at a flying saucer, as the objects would disappear or speed away as soon as an interceptor approached, sometimes outflying their pilots by as much as 1,000 miles an hour. However, in seeming contradiction to the admitted shoot-down order, Air Force headquarters also put out statements that the unidentified flying objects were no threat to the United States and not controlled by a reasoning body. Some public protests resulted, including telegrams and letters to the White House, stating that the policy was dangerous if the UFOs were controlled by extraterrestrial beings, who would obviously be much more technologically advanced than humans. The July 29th Air Force press conference and Air Force's explanation in response to the INS shoot-down stories to calm rising public anxiety and answer the news media's questions about the sightings and hopefully to slow down the numbers of UFO reports being sent to Blue Book, which were clogging normal intelligence channels. Air Force Major Generals John Samford, USAF Director of Intelligence, and Roger Ramey, USAF Director of Operations, held a well-attended press conference at the Pentagon on July 29, 1952. It was the largest Pentagon press conference since World War II. Press stories called Samford and Ramey the Air Force's two top UFO experts. Samford was heavily influenced by Captain Roy James, who had discussed the sightings with him earlier in the day and who also spoke at the conference. Samford declared that the visual sightings over Washington could be explained as misidentified aerial phenomena, such as stars or meteors. Samford also stated that the unknown radar targets could be explained by temperature inversion, which was present in the air over Washington on both nights the radar returns were reported. In addition, Samford argued that the radar contacts were not caused by solid material targets, and therefore posed no threat to national security. In response to a question as to whether the Air Force had recorded similar UFO radar contacts prior to the Washington incident, Samford admitted that there had been hundreds of such contacts where Air Force fighter interceptions had taken place, but stated they were all fruitless. The conference proved to be successful in getting the press off our backs, and Ruppelt later wrote. Among the witnesses who supported Samford's explanation was the crew of a B-25 bomber which had been flying over Washington during the sightings of July 26th and 27th. The bomber was vectored several times by National Airport over unknown targets on the airport's radar scopes, yet the crew could see nothing unusual. Finally, as a crew member related, the radar had a target which turned out to be the Wilson Line steamboat trip to Mount Vernon. The radar was sure as hell picking up the steamboat. Air Force Captain Harold May was in the radar center at Andrews AFB during the sightings of July 19th and 20th. Upon hearing that National Airport's radar had picked up an unknown object heading in his direction, May stepped outside and saw a light that was changing from red to orange to green to red again. At times it dipped suddenly and appeared to lose altitude. However, May eventually concluded that he was simply seeing a star that was distorted by the atmosphere and that its movement was an illusion. At 3 a.m. on July 27th, an Eastern Airlines flight over Washington was told that an unknown object was in its vicinity. The crew could see nothing unusual. When they were told that the object had moved directly behind their plane, they began a sharp turn to try to see the object, but were told by National Airport's radar center that the object had disappeared when they began their turn. At the request of the Air Force, the CAA's Technical Development and Evaluation Center did an analysis of the radar sightings. Their conclusion was that a temperature inversion had been indicated in almost every instance when the unidentified radar targets or visual objects had been reported. Project Blue Book would eventually label the Washington radar objects as mirage effects caused by double inversion, and the visual sightings as meteors coupled with the normal excitement of witnesses. In later years, two prominent UFO skeptics, Dr. Donald Menzel, an astronomer at Harvard University, and Philip Klass, a senior editor for Aviation Week magazine, would also argue in favor of the temperature inversion mirage hypothesis. Criticisms of the Air Force explanation, almost from the moment of General Samford's press conference, eyewitnesses, UFO researchers, and Air Force personnel came forward to criticize the temperature inversion mirage explanation. Captain Ruppelt noted that Major Fournet and Lieutenant Holcomb, who disagreed with the Air Force's explanation, were not in attendance at Samford's press conference. Ruppelt himself discovered that hardly a night passed in June, July, and August in 1952 that there wasn't a temperature inversion in Washington, yet the slow-moving solid radar targets appeared on only a few nights. According to a story printed by INS, the United States Weather Bureau also disagreed with the temperature inversion hypothesis, one official stating that such an inversion ordinarily would appear on a radar screen as a steady line, rather than as single objects as were sighted on the airport radar scope. Also, according to Ruppelt, when he was able to interview the radar and control tower personnel at Washington National Airport, not a single person agreed with the Air Force explanation. Michael Wertheimer, a researcher for the government-funded Condon Report, investigated the case in 1966. He found that the radar witnesses still disputed the Air Force explanation, but that did not stop the report from agreeing with the temperature inversion/mirage explanation. Ruppelt related that on July 27th, the control tower at Washington National had called the control tower at Andrews AFB and notified them that their radar had an unknown object just south of the Andrews control tower, directly over the Andrews AFB radio range station. According to Ruppelt, when the Andrews control tower personnel looked, they all saw a huge fiery orange sphere hovering over the range station. When Ruppelt interviewed the tower personnel several days later, they insisted that they had been mistaken and had merely seen a bright star. However, when Ruppelt checked an astronomical chart, he found that there were no bright stars over the station that night, and that he had heard from a good source that the towermen had been persuaded a bit by superior officers to claim that their sighting was merely a star. There were also witnesses who claimed to see structured craft and not merely glows or bright lights. On July 19th, an Army artillery officer, Joseph Gigandet, was sitting on the front porch of his home in Alexandria, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington. At 9:30 p.m., he claimed to see a red cigar-shaped object, which sailed slowly over his house. Gigandet estimated the object's size as comparable to a DC-7 airplane at about 10,000 feet altitude. He also claimed that the object had a series of lights very closely set together on its sides. The object eventually flew back over his house a second time, which led Gigandet to assume that it was circling the area. When the object flew away a second time, it turned a deeper red color and moved over the city of Washington itself. This occurred less than 2 hours before Edward Nugent first spotted the unknown objects on his radar at Washington National. Gigandet claimed that his neighbor, an FBI agent, also saw the object. Dr. James E. McDonald, a physicist at the University of Arizona and a prominent ufologist in the 1960s, did his own analysis of the Washington sightings. After interviewing 4 pilot eyewitnesses and 5 radar personnel, McDonald argued that the Air Force explanation was physically impossible. Harry Barnes told McDonald that the radar targets were not shapeless blobs such as one gets from ground returns under anomalous propagation, and that he was certain the unknown radar blips were solid targets. Howard Coughlin agreed with Barnes. Aftermath, the Robertson Panel. The extremely high numbers of UFO reports in 1952 disturbed both the Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Both groups felt that an enemy nation could deliberately flood the US with false UFO reports, causing mass panic and allowing them to launch a sneak attack. On September 24, 1952, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI, sent a memorandum to Walter B. Smith, the CIA's director. The memo stated that the flying saucer situation have national security implications. In the public concern with the phenomena lies the potential for the touching off of mass hysteria and panic. The result of this memorandum was the creation in January 1953 of the Robertson Panel. Physicist Howard Percy Robertson chaired the panel, which consisted of prominent scientists and which spent 4 days examining the best UFO cases collected by Project Blue Book. The panel dismissed nearly all of the UFO cases it examined as not representing anything unusual or threatening to national security. In the panel's controversial estimate, the Air Force and Project Blue Book needed to spend less time analyzing and studying UFO reports and more time publicly debunking them. The panel recommended that the Air Force and Project Blue Book should take steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired. Following the panel's report, Project Blue Book would rarely publicize any UFO case that it had not labeled as solved. Unsolved cases were rarely mentioned by the Air Force. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction, 1961. Betty and Barney Hill were an American couple who claimed to have been abducted by extraterrestrials in a rural portion of New Hampshire on September 19th and 20th, 1961. The couple's story, called the Hill Abduction and occasionally the Zeta Reticuli incident, was that they had been kidnapped for a short time by a UFO. Theirs was the first widely publicized claim of alien abduction, adapted into the best-selling 1966 book The Interrupted Journey and the 1975 television movie The UFO Incident. Many of Betty Hill's notes, tapes, and other items have been placed in a permanent collection at the University of New Hampshire, her alma mater. As of July 2011, the site of the alleged craft's first close approach is marked by a state historical marker. Background: the Hills lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Barney, 1922-1969, was employed by the U.S. Postal Service, while Betty, 1919-2004, was a social worker. Active in a Unitarian congregation, the Hills were also members of the NAACP and community leaders, and Barney sat on a local board of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. They were an interracial couple at a time when it was particularly unusual in the United States. Barney was black and Betty was white. The UFO encounter. According to a variety of reports given by the Hills, the alleged UFO sighting happened on September 19, 1961, at around 10:30 p.m. The Hills were driving back to Portsmouth from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal, Quebec, Canada. There were only a few other cars on the road as they made their way home to New Hampshire's seacoast. Just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, Betty claimed to have observed a bright point of light in the sky that moved from below the moon and the planet Jupiter, upward to the west of the moon. While Barney navigated US Route 3, Betty reasoned that she was observing a falling star, only it moved upward like a plane or a satellite. Since it moved erratically and grew bigger and brighter, Betty urged Barney to stop the car for a closer look, as well as to walk their dog, Delcy. Barney stopped at a scenic picnic area just south of Twin Mountain. Worried about the presence of bears, Barney retrieved a pistol that he had concealed in the trunk of the car. Betty, through binoculars, observed an odd-shaped craft flashing multicolored lights travel across the face of the moon. Because her sister had confided to her about having a flying saucer sighting several years earlier, Betty thought it might be what she was observing. Through binoculars, Barney observed what he reasoned was a commercial airliner traveling toward Vermont on its way to Montreal. However, he soon changed his mind, because without looking at if it had turned, the craft rapidly descended in his direction. This observation caused Barney to realize this object that was a plane was not a plane. He quickly returned to the car and drove toward Franconia Notch, a narrow mountainous stretch of the road. The Hills claimed that they continued driving on the isolated road, moving very slowly through Franconia Notch in order to observe the object as it came even closer. At one point, the object passed above a restaurant and signal tower on top of Cannon Mountain. It passed over the mountain and came out near the Old Man of the Mountain. Betty testified that it was at least 1.5 times the length of the granite cliff profile, which is 40 feet long, and that seemed to be rotating. The couple watched as the silent, illuminated craft moved erratically and bounced back and forth in the night sky. As they drove along Route 3 through Franconia Notch, they stated that it seemed to be playing a game of cat and mouse with them. Approximately 1 mile south of Indian Head, they said, the object rapidly descended toward their vehicle, causing Barney to stop directly in the middle of the highway. The huge, silent craft hovered approximately 80 to 100 feet above the Hills' 1957 Chevy Bel Air and filled the entire field of the windshield. It reminded Barney of a huge pancake. Carrying his pistol in his pocket, he stepped away from the vehicle and moved closer to the object. Using the binoculars, Barney claimed to have seen about 8 to 11 humanoid figures who were peering out of the craft's windows, seeming to look at him. In unison, all but one figure moved to what appeared to be a panel on the rear wall of the hallway that encircled the front portion of the craft. The one remaining figure continued to look at Barney and communicated a message telling him to stay where you are and keep looking. Barney had a conscious, continuous recollection of observing the humanoid forms wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. Red lights on what appeared to be bat-wing fins began to telescope out of the sides of the craft, and a long structure descended from the bottom of the craft. The silent craft approached to what Barney estimated was within 50 to 80 feet overhead and 300 feet away from him. On October 21st, 1961, Barney reported to NICAP investigator Walter Webb that the beings were somehow not human. Barney tore the binoculars away from his eyes and ran back to his car. In a near hysterical state, he told Betty, "They're going to capture us." He saw the object again shift its location to directly above the vehicle. He drove away at high speed, telling Betty to look for the object. She rolled down the window and looked up, but saw only darkness above them, even though it was a bright, starry night. Almost immediately, the Hills heard a rhythmic series of beeping or buzzing sounds, which they said seemed to bounce off the trunk of their vehicle. The car vibrated, and a tingling sensation passed through the Hills' bodies. Betty touched the metal on the passenger door, expecting to feel an electric shock, but felt only the vibration. The Hills said that at this point in time, they experienced the onset of an altered state of consciousness that left their minds dulled. A second series of code, like beeping or buzzing sounds, returned the couple to full consciousness. They found that they had traveled nearly 35 miles south, but had only vague, spotty memories of this section of road. They recalled making a sudden unplanned turn, encountering a roadblock, and observing a fiery orb in the road. Immediate aftermath. Arriving home at about dawn, the Hills assert that they had some odd sensations and impulses they could not readily explain. Betty insisted their luggage be kept near the back door rather than in the main part of the house. Their watches would never run again. Barney noted that the leather strap for the binoculars was torn, though he could not recall it tearing. The toes of his best dress shoes were inexplicably scraped. Barney says he was compelled to examine his genitals in the bathroom, though he found nothing unusual. They took long showers to remove possible contamination, and each drew a picture of what they had observed. Their drawings were strikingly similar. Perplexed, the Hills say they tried to reconstruct the chronology of events as they witnessed the UFO and drove home. But immediately after they heard the buzzing sounds, their memories became incomplete and fragmented. They vaguely recalled a luminous moon shape sitting on the road. Barney recalled saying, "Oh no, not again." Betty thought Barney had taken a sharp left turn off Route 3. After sleeping for a few hours, Betty awoke and placed the shoes and clothing she had worn during the drive into her closet, observing that the dress was torn at the hem, zipper, and lining. Later, when she retrieved the items from her closet, she noted a pinkish powder on her dress. She hung the dress on her clothesline, and the pink powder blew away. But the dress was irreparably damaged. She threw it away but then changed her mind, retrieving the dress and hanging it in her closet. Over the years, 5 laboratories have conducted chemical and forensic analyses on the dress. There were shiny concentric circles on their car's trunk that had not been there the previous day. Betty and Barney experimented with a compass, noting that when they moved it close to the spots, the needle would whirl rapidly. But when they moved it a few inches away from the shiny spots, it would drop down. Initial report to the US Air Force and NICAP. On September 21st, Betty telephoned Pease Air Force Base to report their UFO encounter, though for fear of being labeled eccentric, she withheld some of the details. On September 22nd, Major Paul W. Henderson telephoned the Hills for a more detailed interview. Henderson's report, dated September 26th, determined that the Hills had probably misidentified the planet Jupiter. This was later changed to optical condition, inversion, and insufficient data. Report 100-161, Air Intelligence Information Record. His report was forwarded to Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's UFO research project. Within days of the encounter, Betty borrowed a UFO book from a local library. It had been written by retired Marine Corps Major Donald E. Kehoe, who was also the head of NICAP, a civilian UFO research group. On September 26th, Betty wrote to Kehoe. She related the full story, including the details about the humanoid figures that Barney had observed through binoculars. Betty wrote that she and Barney were considering hypnosis to help recall what had happened. Her letter was eventually passed on to Walter N. Webb, a Boston astronomer and NICAP member. Webb met with the Hills on October 21, 1961. In a 6-hour interview, the Hills related all they could remember of the UFO encounter. Barney asserted that he had developed a sort of mental block and that he suspected there were some portions of the event that he did not wish to remember. He described in detail all that he could remember about the craft and the appearance of the somehow not human figures aboard the craft. Webb stated that they were telling the truth and the incident probably occurred exactly as reported, except for some minor uncertainties and technicalities that must be tolerated in any such observations where human judgment is involved. Exact time and length of visibility, apparent sizes of object and occupants, distance and height of object, etc. Betty's dreams. 10 days after the UFO encounter, Betty began having a series of vivid dreams. They continued for 5 successive nights. Never in her memory had she recalled dreams in such detail and intensity. But they stopped abruptly after 5 nights and never returned again. They occupied her thoughts during the day. When she finally did mention them to Barney, he was sympathetic but not too concerned, and the matter was dropped. Betty did not mention them to Barney again. In November 1961, Betty began writing down the details of her dreams. In one dream, she and Barney encountered a roadblock and men who surrounded their car. She lost consciousness, but struggled to regain it. She then realized that she was being forced by 2 small men to walk in a forest in the nighttime, and of seeing Barney walking behind her, though when she called to him, he seemed to be in a trance or sleepwalking. The men stood about 5 feet to 5 feet, 4 inches tall, and wore matching uniforms, with caps similar to those worn by military cadets. They appeared nearly human, but with bald heads, large wraparound eyes, small ears, and almost absent noses. Their skin was a greyish colour. In the dreams, Betty, Barney, and the men walked up a ramp into a disc-shaped craft of metallic appearance. Once inside, Barney and Betty were separated. She protested and was told by a man she called the leader that if she and Barney were examined together, it would take much longer to conduct the exams. She and Barney were then taken to separate rooms. Betty then dreamt that a new man, similar to the others, entered to conduct her exam with the leader. Betty called this new man the examiner and said he had a pleasant, calm manner. Though the leader and the examiner spoke to her in English, the examiner's command of the language seemed imperfect, and she had difficulty understanding him. The examiner told Betty that he would conduct a few tests to note the differences between humans and the craft's occupants. He seated her on a chair and a bright light was shone on her. The man cut off a lock of Betty's hair. He examined her eyes, ears, mouth, teeth, throat, and hands. He saved trimmings from her fingernails. After examining her legs and feet, the man then used a dull knife, similar to a letter opener, to scrape some of her skin onto what resembled cellophane. He then tested her nervous system, and he thrust the needle into her navel, which caused Betty agonizing pain. But the leader waved his hand in front of her eyes, and the pain vanished. The examiner left the room, and Betty engaged in conversation with the leader. She picked up a book with rows of strange symbols that the leader said she could take home with her. She also asked where he was from, and he pulled down an instructional map dotted with stars. In Betty's dream account, the men began escorting the Hills from the ship when a disagreement broke out. The leader then informed Betty that she couldn't keep the book, stating that they had decided that the other men did not want her to even remember the encounter. Betty insisted that no matter what they did to her memory, she would one day recall the events. She and Barney were taken to their car, where the leader suggested that they wait to watch the craft's departure. They did so, then resumed their drive. Medical help and more interviews of missing time. On November 25, 1961, the Hills were again interviewed at length by NICAP members, this time C.D. Jackson and Robert E. Homan. Having read Webb's initial report, Jackson and Homan had many questions for the Hills. One of their main questions was about the length of the trip. Neither Webb nor the Hills had noted that, though the drive should have taken about 4 hours, they did not arrive at home until 7 hours after their departure. When Homan and Jackson noted this discrepancy to the Hills, the couple had no explanation, a frequently reported circumstance in alleged alien abduction cases that some have called missing time. As Clark writes, despite all their efforts, the Hills could recall almost nothing of the 35 miles between Indian Head and Ashland. Although Betty's recall was somewhat fuller than Barney's, both were able to recall an image of a fiery orb sitting on the ground. Betty and Barney reasoned that it must have been the moon, but Homan and Jackson informed them that the moon had set earlier in the evening. The subject of hypnosis came up. Perhaps hypnosis could unlock the missing memories. Barney was apprehensive about hypnosis, but thought it might help Betty put to rest what Barney described as the nonsense about her dreams. By February 1962, the Hills were making frequent weekend drives to the White Mountains, hoping that revisiting the site might spark more memories. They were unsuccessful in trying to locate the site, where they observed a fiery orb sitting in the road. However, they were able to eliminate several possible routes. They found the capture site on Labor Day weekend in 1965. Private disclosure. On November 23, 1962, the Hills attended a meeting at the parsonage of their church where the invited guest speaker was Captain Ben H. Sweat of the U.S. Air Force, who had recently published a book of his poetry. After he read selections of his poetry, the pastor asked him to discuss his personal interest in hypnosis. After the meeting broke up, the Hills approached Captain Sweat privately and told him what they could remember of their strange encounter. He was particularly interested in the missing time of the Hills' account. The Hills asked Sweat if he would hypnotize them to recover their memories, but Sweat said he was not qualified to do that and cautioned them against going to an amateur hypnotist such as himself. First public disclosure. On March 3, 1963, the Hills first publicly discussed the UFO encounter with a group at their church. On September 7, 1963, Captain Sweat gave a formal lecture on hypnosis to a meeting at the Unitarian Church. After the lecture, the Hills told him that Barney was going to a psychiatrist, Dr. Stevens, whom he liked and trusted. Captain Sweat suggested that Barney ask Dr. Stevens about the use of hypnosis in his case. When Barney next met with Dr. Stevens, he asked about hypnosis. Stevens referred the Hills to Dr. Benjamin Simon of Boston. On November 3, 1963, the Hills spoke before an amateur UFO study group, the Two-State UFO Study Group, in Quincy Center, Massachusetts. The Hills first met Dr. Simon on December 14, 1963. Early in their discussions, Simon determined that the UFO encounter was causing Barney far more worry and anxiety than he was willing to admit. Though Simon dismissed the popular extraterrestrial hypothesis as impossible, it seemed obvious to him that the Hills genuinely thought they had witnessed a UFO with human-like occupants. Simon hoped to uncover more about the experience through hypnosis. Dr. Simon's hypnosis sessions. Simon began hypnotizing the Hills on January 4, 1964. He hypnotized Betty and Barney several times each, and the sessions lasted until June 6, 1964. Simon conducted the sessions on Barney and Betty separately, so they could not overhear one another's recollections. At the end of each session, he reinstated amnesia. Barney sessions. Simon hypnotized Barney first. His recall of witnessing non-human figures was quite emotional, punctuated with expressions of fear, emotional outbursts, and incredulity. Barney said that, due to his fear, he kept his eyes closed for much of the abduction and physical examination. Based on these early responses, Simon told Barney that he would not remember the hypnosis sessions until he was certain he could remember them without being further traumatized. Under hypnosis, as was consistent with his conscious recall, Barney reported that the binocular strap had broken when he ran from the UFO back to his car. He recalled driving the car away from the UFO, but that afterwards he felt irresistibly compelled to pull off the road and drive into the woods. He eventually sighted 6 men standing in the dirt road. The car stalled, and 3 of the men approached the car. They told Barney to not fear them. He was still anxious, however, and he reported that the leader told Barney to close his eyes. While hypnotized, Barney said, "I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes." Barney described the beings as generally similar to Betty's hypnotic, not dream recollection. "The beings often stared into his eyes," said Barney, with a terrifying, mesmerizing effect. Under hypnosis, Barney said things like, "Oh, those eyes, they're there in my brain," much from his first hypnosis session, "and I was told to close my eyes because I saw 2 eyes coming close to mine, and I felt like the eyes had pushed into my eyes," from his second hypnosis session. "And all I see are these eyes. I'm not even afraid that they're not connected to a body. They're just there. They're just up close to me, pressing against my eyes." Barney related that he and Betty were taken onto the disc-shaped craft, where they were separated. He was escorted to a room by 3 of the men and told to lie on a small rectangular exam table. Unlike Betty, Barney's narrative of the exam was fragmented, and he continued to keep his eyes closed for most of the exam. A cup-like device was placed over his genitals. He did not experience an orgasm, though Barney thought that a sperm sample had been taken. The men scraped his skin and peered in his ears and mouth. A tube or cylinder was inserted in his anus. Someone felt his spine and seemed to be counting his vertebrae. While Betty reported extended conversations with the beings in English, Barney said that he heard them speaking in a mumbling language he did not understand. Betty also mentioned this detail. The few times they communicated with him, Barney said it seemed to be thought transferences. At that time, he was unfamiliar with the word telepathy. Both Betty and Barney stated that they hadn't observed the beings' mouths moving when they communicated in English with them. He recalled being escorted from the ship and taken to his car, which was now near the road, rather than in the woods. In a daze, he watched the ship leave. Barney remembered a light appearing on the road, and he said, "Oh, no, not again." He recalled Betty's speculation that the light might have been the moon, though the moon had in fact set several hours earlier. He also stated that he attempted to produce the code-like buzzing sounds which seemed to strike the car's trunk a second time, by driving from side to side and stopping and starting the vehicle. His attempt was unsuccessful. Betty's sessions. Under hypnosis, Betty's account was very similar to the events of her 5 dreams about the UFO abduction, but there were also notable differences. Under hypnosis, her capture and release were different. The technology on the craft was different. The short men had a significantly different physical appearance than the ones in her dreams. The sequential order of the abduction event was also different than in Betty's dream account. She filled in many details that were not in her dreams and contradicted some of her dream content. It is interesting that Barney's and Betty's memories in hypnotic regression were consistent but contradicted some of the information in Betty's dreams. Betty exhibited considerable emotional distress during her capture and examination. Dr. Simon ended one session early because tears were flowing down her cheeks and she was in considerable agony. Dr. Simon gave Betty the post-hypnotic suggestion that she could sketch a copy of the star map that she later described as a three-dimensional projection similar to a hologram. She hesitated, thinking she would be unable to accurately depict the three-dimensional quality of the map she says she saw on the ship. Eventually, however, she did what Simon suggested. Although she said the map had many stars, she drew only those that stood out in her memory. Her map consisted of 12 prominent stars connected by lines and 3 lesser ones that formed a distinctive triangle. She said she was told the stars connected by solid lines formed trade routes, whereas dashed lines were to less travelled stars. Dr. Simon's conclusions. After extensive hypnosis sessions, Dr. Simon concluded that Barney's recall of the UFO encounter was a fantasy inspired by Betty's dreams. Though Simon admitted this hypothesis didn't explain every aspect of the experience, he thought it was the most plausible and consistent explanation. Barney rejected this idea, noting that while their memories were in some regards interlocking, there were also portions of both their narratives that were unique to each. Barney was now ready to accept that they had been abducted by the occupants of a UFO, though he never embraced it as fully as Betty did. Though the Hills and Simon disagreed about the nature of the case, they all concurred that the hypnosis sessions were effective. The Hills were no longer tormented by anxiety about the UFO encounter. Afterwards, Simon wrote an article about the Hills for the journal Psychiatric Opinion, explaining his conclusions that the case was a singular psychological aberration. Publicity after the hypnosis sessions. The Hills went back to their regular lives. They were willing to discuss the UFO encounter with friends, family, and the occasional UFO researcher, but the Hills apparently made no effort to seek publicity. But on October 25, 1965, a newspaper story changed everything. A front-page story on the Boston Traveler asked UFO Chiller, did they seize the couple? Reporter John H. Luttrell of the Traveler had allegedly been given an audio tape recording of the lecture the Hills had made in Quincy Center in late 1963. Luttrell learned that the Hills had undergone hypnosis with Dr. Simon. He also obtained notes from confidential interviews the Hills had given to UFO investigators. On October 26, the UPI picked up Luttrell's story, and the Hills earned international attention. In 1966, writer John G. Fuller secured the cooperation of the Hills and Dr. Simon and wrote the book The Interrupted Journey about the case. The book included a copy of Betty's sketch of the star map. The book was a quick success and went through several printings. Barney died of a cerebral hemorrhage on February 25, 1969, at age 46. Betty Hill died of cancer on October 17, 2004, at age 85, analyzing the star map. Marjorie Fish interpretation of Betty Hill's purported alien star map, with Sol being the Latin name for the sun. In 1968, Marjorie Fish of Oak Harbor, Ohio read Fuller's Interrupted Journey. She was an elementary school teacher and amateur astronomer. Intrigued by the star map, Fish wondered if it might be deciphered to determine which star system the UFO came from. Assuming that one of the 15 stars on the map must represent the Earth's sun, Fish constructed a three-dimensional model of nearby sun-like stars using thread and beads, basing stellar distances on those published in the 1969 Gliese star catalogue. Studying thousands of vantage points over several years, the only one that seemed to match the Hill map was from the viewpoint of the double star system of Zeta Reticuli. Distance information needed to match 3 stars, forming the distinctive triangle Hill said she remembered, was not generally available until the 1969 Gliese catalogue came out. Fish sent her analysis to Webb. Agreeing with her conclusions, Webb sent the map to Terence Dickinson, editor of the popular magazine Astronomy. Dickinson did not endorse Fish and Webb's conclusions, but for the first time in the journal's history, Astronomy invited comments and debate on a UFO report, starting with an opening article in the December 1974 issue. For about a year afterward, the opinions page of Astronomy carried arguments for and against Fish's star map. Notable was an argument made by Carl Sagan and Stephen Soter, arguing that the seeming star map was little more than a random alignment of chance points. In contrast, those more favorable to the map, such as Dr. David Saunders, a statistician who had been on the Condon UFO study, argued that unusual alignment of key sun-like stars in a plane centered around Zeta Reticuli, first described by Fish, was statistically improbable to have happened by chance from a random group of stars in our immediate neighborhood. Skeptic Robert Schieffer, in an accompanying article, said that a map devised by Charles W. Atterberg about the same time as Fish was an even better match to Hill's map and made more sense. The base stars, Epsilon Indi and Epsilon Eridani, plus the others, were also closer to the Sun than the Hill map. Fish counter-argued that the base stars in the Atterberg map were considered much less likely to harbour life than Zeta Reticuli, and the map lacked a consistent grouping of sun-like stars along the lined routes. In 1993, two German crop circle enthusiasts, Joachim Koch and Hans-Jürgen Kieborg, suggested that the map depicted planets in the solar system, not nearby stars. The objects in the map, they said, closely matched the positions of the Sun, the 6 inner planets, and several asteroids around the time of the incident. This would parallel other abduction accounts where witnesses claimed to be shown such depictions, though admittedly often elaborate and unmistakably our own solar system. Interrupted Journey, the 1966 publication of Interrupted Journey by John G. Fuller, details much of the Hills' claims. Excerpts of the book were published in Look magazine, and Interrupted Journey went on to sell many copies and greatly publicize the Hills' account. Betty's niece, Kathleen Marden, explored Fuller's themes along with scientist Stanton T. Friedman in her book, Captured, The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Marden knew Betty well and had spoken with her at great length about the encounter. Later, Betty claimed to have seen UFOs a number of times after the initial abduction, and she became a celebrity in the UFO community. Skeptical arguments. Psychiatrists reportedly later suggested that the supposed abduction was a hallucination brought on by the stress of being an interracial couple in early 1960s United States. Betty discounted this suggestion, noting her relationship with Barney was happy, and their interracial marriage caused no notable problems with their friends or family. As noted in the Interrupted Journey, Dr. Simon thought that the Hills' marital status had nothing to do with the UFO encounter. Skeptic blogger Brian Dunning reports that the hypnosis sessions occurred over 2 years after the reported abductions, plenty of time for the couple to discuss their encounter. In a 2008 article, Dunning calls their story merely an inventive tale from the mind of a lifelong UFO fanatic, and is unsupported by any useful evidence and is perfectly consistent with the purely natural explanation. An alien, played by actor John Hoyt, depicted on TV 12 days before the making of Hill's Grey hypnosis tape. In his 1990 article Entirely Unpredisposed, Martin Kottmeyer suggested that Barney's memories revealed under hypnosis might have been influenced by an episode of the science fiction television show The Outer Limits titled The Bolero Shield, which was broadcast about 2 weeks before Barney's first hypnotic session. The episode featured an extraterrestrial with large eyes who says, "In all the universes, in all the unities beyond the universes, all who have eyes that speak." The report from the regression featured a scenario that was in some respects similar to the television show. In part, Kottmeyer wrote, "Wraparound eyes are an extreme rarity in science fiction films. I know of only one instance. They appeared on the alien of an episode of an old TV series, The Outer Limits, entitled The Bolero Shield. A person familiar with Barney's sketch in The Interrupted Journey, and the sketch done in collaboration with the artist David Baker, will find a frisson of déjà vu creeping up his spine when seeing this episode. The resemblance is much abetted by an absence of ears, hair and nose on both aliens. Could it be by chance? Consider this. Barney first described and drew the wraparound eyes during the hypnosis session, dated 22nd February 1964. The Bolero Shield was first broadcast on 10th February 1964. Only 12 days separate the two instances. If the identification is admitted, The commonness of wraparound eyes in the abduction literature falls to cultural forces. When a different researcher asked Betty about the outer limits, she insisted she had never heard of it. Kottmeyer also pointed out that some motifs in the Hills account were present in the 1953 film, Invaders from Mars. A careful analysis of Barney's description of the non-human entities that he observed reveals significant differences between the Bifrost man and Barney's descriptive details. One must also take into account Barney's conscious recall of the entities he observed on the hovering craft. They were dressed in black, shiny uniforms and were somehow not human. Jim MacDonald, a resident of the area in which the Hills claimed to have been abducted, has produced a detailed analysis of their journey, which concludes that the episode was, in fact, provoked by their misperceiving an aircraft warning beacon on Cannon Mountain as a UFO. MacDonald notes that from the road the Hills took the beacon appears and disappears at exactly the same time the Hills described the UFO as appearing and disappearing. The remainder of the experience is ascribed to stress, sleep deprivation, and false memories recovered under hypnosis. UFO expert Robert Schaefer writes after reading MacDonald's recreation that the Hills are the poster children for not driving when sleep-deprived. MacDonald's article focuses primarily on the Hills' observations of the light in the sky and the timing of the journey, discounting the Hills' accounts of close encounters south of Cannon Mountain as recovered memories. Schaefer reports that Betty Hill, as late as 1977, would still go on UFO vigils 3 times a week. During one evening, she was joined by UFO enthusiast John Oswald. When asked about Betty's continuing UFO observations, Oswald stated, "She's not really seeing UFOs, but she's calling them that." On the night they went out together, Mrs. Hill was unable to distinguish between a landed UFO and a streetlight. In a later interview, Schaefer recounts that Betty Hill writes, "UFOs are a new science, and our science cannot explain them." The curious case of Billy Meyer, 1964 to present day. Billy, Edward Albert Meyer, born February 3, 1937, is a citizen of Switzerland who is the source of many controversial UFO photographs. He presents these photographs as evidence to support claims that he is in contact with extraterrestrials. In addition, he has also presented other controversial material during the 1970s, such as metal samples, sound recordings, and film footage. Meyer reports regular contacts with extraterrestrials he calls the Pleiaren. Meyer claims that the Pleiaren look similar in appearance to humans from Northern Europe and states that the Pleiaren homeworld is called Era. It is located in a dimension which is a fraction of a second shifted from our own dimension, about 80 light-years beyond the Pleiades, an open star cluster. The Pleiaren were given the name Pleiadians by Meyer up to 1995. Background. Born in the town of Bulak in the Zürcher Unterland, Meyer joined the French Foreign Legion in his teens, but says he soon left and returned home. He traveled extensively around the world pursuing spiritual exploration, covering 42 countries over 12 years. In 1965, he lost his left arm in a bus accident in Turkey. In 1966, he met and married a Greek woman, Calliope Zafariou, with whom he has 3 children. The nickname Billy came by way of an American friend who thought Meyer's cowboy style of dress reminded her of Billy the Kid. This anecdote was told by Meyer himself in an interview with Bob Zanotti of Swiss Radio International in June 1982. Billy Edward Albert Meyer. Meyer has accumulated a large collection of photographs showing alleged spaceships that he calls beam ships, as well as alleged Pleiaren. Meyer says that the Pleiaren gave him permission to photograph and film their beam ships, so that he could produce some evidence for their extraterrestrial visitations. Meyer's claims are both believed and disputed by UFO skeptics and enthusiasts. Meyer began publishing his collection of photographs in the 1970s. His photographs were featured in various newspapers and magazines from around the world, such as The Quick, Blick, Argosy UFO, and Il Giornale dei Misteri. Topics: India, mid-1964. Billy. Edward Albert Myers claimed his first extraterrestrial contacts occurred in 1942 at the age of 5 with an elderly extraterrestrial man named Svath. Contacts with Svath lasted until 1953, shortly before Svath passed away. From 1953 to 1964, Maya's contacts continued with an extraterrestrial woman called Asket, who is not a Plejaren. Maya says that after an 11-year break, contacts resumed again, beginning on January 28, 1975, with an extraterrestrial woman named Semyase, the granddaughter of Svath. Maya says that he has also had many contacts with another Plejaren man called Ptah, starting in 1975 and continuing right up to the present day. Now, he has claimed that he has also visited other worlds and galaxies, along with another universe with these extraterrestrials. Maya claims that he was instructed to transcribe his conversations with the various extraterrestri, most of which have been published in the German language. These books are referred to as the contact notes or contact reports. Currently, there are 26 published volumes of the contact reports, titled Plejarische Kontaktberichte. Some of the contact reports were translated into English, extensively edited and expurgated, and published in the out-of-print 4-volume set message from the Pleiades, the contact notes of Eduard Billy Maya by Maya case investigator Wendell C. Stevens. There are also many contact reports translated into English, unedited, by Benjamin Stevens. Maya's discussions with the Plejaren are highly detailed and wide-ranging, dealing with subjects ranging from spirituality and the afterlife to the dangers of mainstream religions, human history, science and astronomical phenomena, ecology and environmental dangers caused by global overpopulation, in addition to prophecies and predictions of future events. An additional aspect of the Maya case is the highly controversial book, the Talmud Germanual, based on the translation of ancient Aramaic scrolls purportedly discovered in 1963 in a tomb just south of the old city of Jerusalem by Maya and Isa Rashid. The book claims to be the original teachings and life events of the man named Germanuel, called Jesus Christ by historians and Christians. Photographs and films, one of Maya's photographs. Some of the most important evidence for Maya's claims come from his large collection of photographs. These include images of metallic discs floating above the Swiss countryside, the 1975 docking of Apollo-Soyuz, pictures of celestial objects from a non-earthly vantage point, pictures of apparent extraterrestrials, prehistoric earthly scenes, and scenes of a devastated future. The photographs, films, sound recordings, and Maya himself were the subject of an investigation lasting more than 5 years by Wendell C. Stevens and his American team of analytic experts. The investigation was the subject of Larry Savadov's 1982 documentary film Contact. Stevens and his team employed a wide range of investigative techniques, such as photogrammetric and computer analysis of photographs, tonal and dynamic analysis of recorded sounds, recreation of models and extensive polygraph tests on Maya and his acquaintances. Some UFO researchers, such as Stanton T. Friedman and Jacques Vallée, publicly dismiss the Maya case, while others believe the Maya case to be the most thoroughly researched and validated UFO case in our history. Some critics have provided examples of faked photos similar to what Maya produced and have pointed out that some of his photos correspond to scenes that were subsequently found in science fiction books, paintings, and television programs. Maya claims that some of his photos were altered by intelligence agencies and slipped into his collection in order to discredit his UFO testimony. Cal K. Korff has been particularly vociferous in dismissing the Maya case, pointing to proof of Maya's fakery obviated by finding light direction and focal discrepancies consistent with cut-and-paste and model techniques. Photographic analysis was performed on Maya's photographs and films in the late 1970s, when Maya first started to publish his photographs. In 1978, a report titled Preliminary Photo Analysis, written by physicist Neil M. Davis at Design Technology in Poway, California, provided test results of an analysis of one of Maya's controversial photographs. Using microscopic examination, density contour plots, examination for evidence of double exposure, photo, paste-up, or a model at short range suspended on a string. They state, nothing was found to indicate a hoax, and concluded, nothing was found in the examination of the print which could cause me to believe that the object in the photos is anything other than a large object photographed at distance from the camera. They also recommended that the print was a second-generation photograph, and a more detailed analysis of the photo can only properly be made on the original film negative. Recreations of Maya's images were created by photographic effects specialist and stop-motion animator Alan Friswell for the June 2005 issue of 14 Times magazine. Friswell had employed techniques used in the pre-digital age of film special effects, as modern processes would, in Friswell's opinion, have been unsporting. Using old-fashioned tricks, such as foreground miniatures and photographic cutouts, Friswell crafted copies of Maya's UFO pictures, but claimed that his pictures did not in any way confirm that Maya was a hoaxer, as without personal experience of the events, he had no right to draw conclusive opinions one way or the other. A study conducted by the IIG concluded that Maya could have created the photographs using household items. Contrasting this research, in a report titled Analysis of the Wedding Cake UFO, a researcher who calls himself Ral Zahi attempted to determine the size of the UFO in one of Maya's photographs by analyzing the reflections of surrounding objects on the metallic surface of the UFO. With the aid of Blender, a 3D modeling program, satellite imagery, and a scale model of Maya's property, the author determined that the UFO in the picture is an object greater than 3 meters in diameter. Metal samples. In Savadov's documentary Contact, a metallurgist's examination of Billy Maya's metal revealed, "We have little marker bars here that we can line up on each peak as they come up. This one indicates that we have silver there. Over here, let's see, we've got some copper, a small amount of copper. That looks about all that's in here at the moment." In 1979, Maya sent Marcel Vogel, a chemist working at IBM, crystal and metal samples Maya claimed to have received from the player, and Vogel examined these samples with a scanning electron microscope and reported, "When I touched the oxide with a stainless steel probe, red streaks appeared and the oxide coating disappeared. I just touched the metal like that, and it started to deoxidize and become a pure metal. I have never seen a phenomenon like that before." Vogel also claimed that another metal sample he examined contained nearly every element in the periodic table, stating, "Each pure element was bonded to each of the others, yet somehow retained its own identity." At 25,000 times magnification, Vogel claims the sample was metal, but at the same time, it is crystal. A piece of text transcribed from a video file from an interview of Vogel goes, "It's a very unusual combination from a metallurgical standpoint. I've shown these to metallurgists and they shake their heads. The most unusual thing you'll see purity of these metals in adjacency to one another without their cross-contamination. They're very sensitive to marking. The soonest I've exposed them to intense light from my microscope, the metal oxidizes very rapidly and just breaks down. I've never seen that." On the right side, there are 2 screen captures from the same video file, front view and rear view of one of the 3 samples he claims he received, in Wendell C. Stevens's book UFO. Contact from the Pleiades, a preliminary investigation report, 1982, on page 424 states, "Looking at the piece by X-ray diffraction for elemental analysis, he found a single element deposit of thulium, a rare transition element in the lanthide series, and also of rhenium, another rare metal." Further down the page is also the following paragraph. "Looking at that part spectrographically, the thulium remarkably showed only the primary band spike for that element. No secondary bands existed. All of the elements examined spectrographically had missing bands in their spectrums, which should have been there if they were normal atomic spectra. This indicates that the elements are put together in a very unusual way from normal Earth technology. The spectrographic bands are entirely different, beyond what one would consider an isotope. The bands showed a very high elemental purity and no secondary bands and no catalyst. Most of the elements studied showed the same unearthly characteristics. Due to the disappearance of the metal samples and no peer review process being adhered to, it is not possible to scientifically verify Vogel's claims today." On page 426 is an explanation of the disappearance of the specimen. The specimen was being carried on Vogel's person in a small plastic envelope to Ames research laboratories for still more exotic tests, when the metal specimen simply disappeared, leaving the envelope completely undisturbed. The Independent Investigations Group, IIG, analyzed the data from Marcel Vogel presented in the 1985 video Beam Ship, the metal analysis, and in Wendell Stevens' book mentioned above. The IIG concluded the following. The element found was aluminum and not thulium. The evidence for the presence of all elements in the sample is in fact bremsstrahlung radiation, with no bearing on element composition. The structure that suggests exotic micro-manipulation can be found on the surface of metals machined by ordinary cutting tools in a machine shop, and the evidence of crystal birefringence detected using Namaski and cross-polarized microscopy can be reproduced by the topography of a simple metal structure with no birefringence associated to it. The IIG said it did not find data supporting the presence of rhenium or any other rare earth element. Sound recordings. Another controversial aspect of Meyer's claims of contacts is the sound recordings he claims to have made of UFOs. On April 14, 1976, Meyer claimed to have made a 6-minute sound recording of a UFO in flight that was at the same time being pursued by a Swiss Air Force Mirage jet fighter. In the documentary Contact, Wendell C. Stevens and his investigation team received a copy of this controversial sound recording from Meyer, and subsequently sent it off for analysis to various sound laboratories in the United States. One of the sound engineers reported, Naval Undersea Sound Center in Groton, Connecticut. They first identified all sounds not originating from the target object. 3 conventional aircraft were detected, 2 of which were propeller-driven. The third was a single-engine jet. Frequency graphs were prepared and a match was looked for in the sound bank archives. The third airplane was a Mirage single-engine jet fighter. No unusual characteristics were detected with respect to the conventional aircraft sounds. Additional background noises detected included a small barking dog, a crow cawing, an European police siren, and some clicks and vibrations, possibly the clicking of the shutter on the camera. No match was ever found in the sound bank for the target sounds of the spacecraft in this study. Reported attempts on Meyer's life. In a television interview conducted by Nippon Television in 1980, Meyer and Stevens recount of a life-threatening event. They recount that at the evening time of May 10, 1980 at 10:01 p.m., while Stevens was investigating on site at Meyer's property, a gunshot was fired and a bullet nearly hit them. It missed Meyer's head by only 8 inches. In this interview, they reenacted the events that transpired that night, showing the remains of the bullet they found later that evening and how it landed on a concrete wall directly behind the couch they were sitting on. Meyer claims in this interview that this was not the first attempt on his life. Meyer further claims 2 other incidents on the interview, one occurring in Hinwil in the winter time between 7 and 8 p.m., where a bullet was shot through his office window, closely missing his head, and the other at 4 a.m., where he was shot in the chest. Books and contact reports. Billy Meyer has authored approximately 40 books and additionally has compiled over 6,000 pages of contact reports, all of which are available in German. Although very few of his books have been translated into English, the final translation of Goblet of the Truth is now available as a free download. Here are some of the key points raised in the contact reports. 1. Our sun has a dark twin which is located about 1 light year away. Therefore, we live in a binary star system. 2. There are 280 chemical elements in the universe, but it is a creational law that no single star contains all 280 of them. 3. The next inhabited solar system is around 5 light years away from Earth. Different worlds in that system are inhabited by human forms of life. One of the planets located there is called Akkad. 4. There was another planet in our solar system called Malona, which was destroyed by its inhabitants. The asteroid belt is the remnants of that former planet. 5. Our universe is around 46 trillion years old, not billions of years old, as our scientists claim. This concludes our presentation of UFO History Compilation 2.
Some just gave them, yeah, been just